They gathered at noon because cruelty prefers daylight, the town pressing around the whipping post while a native girl, perhaps 12, clung to the stake and breathed through a gag that should never have touched a child. Nora James, who scrubbed floors at the boarding house, felt something harden behind her ribs when the mayor droned charges. Insolence, stealing biscuits, speaking to the wrong people. When the lash raised its shadow, she stepped forward, tore off her own apron strings, and said, steady as a nail, "Leave the child, I'll take it." Snickers rose. Someone muttered that orphans were made for such work. The girl's eyes, wide and unblinking, found Nora like a thrown rope. The first stroke burned, the second buckled her breath. By the sixth, she bit blood. By the ninth, she tasted iron and dust and remembered a bread bundle she had tied for strangers last winter, seamed with blue double thread she could always recognize. At the 10th, her knees gave. She collapsed, cheek to splinters, back raw. No one saw the 5 riders until sunlight turned to dust around their horses. They dismounted in one motion, and the square learned another kind of silence. They were brothers, Comanche men whose presence drew breath from the crowd. The eldest raised an open hand. The ropesman froze. The youngest knelt where Nora had fallen, slid an arm beneath her head, and stared at her torn hem with a shock that didn't belong to this hour, as though the blue double thread there had spoken his name. He loosened a thin strip of the same thread tied at his wrist, met his brother's eyes. They did not threaten. Instead, all 5 went to their knees at Nora's side, a circle in the dust, heads bowed to the woman who had bled for a child not her own. From their belts they drew plain rawhide, reins cut short, bootlaces, and the middle brother braided them with careful hands into a simple band, no richer than a shoelace and somehow heavier than iron. The eldest lifted Nora's head. The youngest set the band above her brow, careful of the wounds, while the others kept their palms open to show no harm would come. The eldest offered the only words they carried for such an hour, to the girl and to the town that had come to watch pain like theater. No child alone. The 5th brother repeated it. The words traveled through them and reached the girl, who whispered them back, borrowing strength. The mayor tried to speak and discovered it cost more than he had. The men at the rope found there was nothing to pull when the square refused to move. The youngest lifted Nora, and the middle poured water along her torn back, hands steady, the rawhide band catching sun. When Nora's lashes fluttered, she saw 5 strangers kneeling, the girl freed and clinging to a sleeve, and townspeople standing as though someone had opened a window inside their chests. A woman crossed with her shawl for Nora's shoulders. A farmer stepped forward with his hat. A boy who had laughed pressed his lips white and stopped. The brothers rose together, carried Nora from the post through a lane the crowd made without being told. Behind them the stake stood naked in the noon, its shadow smaller than the people who had built it. At the corner, the youngest glanced at the faint mark the blue thread had left on his wrist. Then at the matching stitch on Nora's torn hem, and she saw him see her with recognition rather than pity, at last. They carried Nora into the shade of the livery, the 5 Comanche brothers moving like a single body, the youngest still cradling her head against his chest, while townsfolk trailed behind, guilty silence pressing on every boot step. The native girl who had been spared clung to Nora's apron hem, refusing to let go even when the eldest brother knelt to check Nora's pulse. Her breath came shallow, lips cracked, skin fevered from lash and heat, yet her eyes opened to slivers and found the girl first, whispering, "You're safe now." The girl's tears fell hot against her wrist. Elias, the eldest, tore linen from his own sleeve and pressed it to her wounds, while Mateo, the second, barked at the stable boy for clean water. In a place where Comanche presence usually drew spit and slurs, the boy obeyed without question, his hands trembling. When the water came, it was the third brother, Raphael, who knelt and poured it slowly down Nora's back, his voice low as he said in halting English, "You held pain that was not yours. No child alone. That is our vow." Nora's gaze fluttered to him, confusion threading with pain. She tried to speak but coughed, and the fourth brother, Thomas, pressed a cup to her lips, steadying her trembling hands. The youngest, Gabriel, who had noticed the blue double thread at her apron hem, touched it gently now, his thumb brushing over the seam as though it were a relic. "You stitched with care," he murmured, not to shame but to acknowledge, and when she met his eyes, she saw not pity, but recognition, a silent respect that steadied her more than the water. Behind them, townsfolk lingered uneasily, watching 5 men who had come not with rifles but with honor, kneeling for a stranger they had no blood tie to. Some muttered uneasily, "How could an orphan woman and Comanche warriors share anything?" Others looked away in shame, remembering the laughter they had loosed when the whip first cracked. It was the mayor who broke first, pushing through with bluster, voice raised as though noise could undo what honor had stitched in silence. "This is disorder," he barked. "She interfered in lawful punishment. You 5 have no claim here. Dusthaven's justice belongs to Dusthaven." Elias rose to his full height, tall as the barn's doorway, blood still wet on his torn sleeve. "Justice?" he said, the word ground like stone. "Whip a child until she breaks? Make a crowd of your neighbors laugh at her pain? That is not law." "That is cowardice." The words struck like hammers, and the people shifted, some lowering their heads, a few nodding quietly. The mayor flushed, but before he could bark again, Nora lifted her head from Gabriel's arm, voice hoarse but clear enough to carry. "If you call it law," she whispered, "then let the same rope bind you too, because I saw no crime, only hunger and fear." She faltered, nearly collapsing again, but Gabriel steadied her, his hand firm at her shoulder. "You will not stand alone," he said, and the brothers spoke the vow together, low and steady in their own tongue, ending in English. "No child alone." The words moved like wind through dry grass, catching ears that had never heard them before. Women exchanged looks, clutching children closer. A boy who had jeered earlier whispered the words back, ashamed. In that moment, the phrase stopped being Comanche alone and became human. The mayor spat, but his voice no longer carried. The crowd was already shifting, no longer his. Clara Jenkins, who ran the bakery, stepped forward and laid a loaf in Nora's lap, eyes wet. "She bled for a child," Clara said, voice breaking. "I'll bake for her as long as I've flour." The words cracked the silence, and others began to stir, small acts rising like embers, while the brothers held their circle around Nora, not as warriors threatening war, but as men who had chosen honor over fear, showing Dusthaven what true justice looked like. By evening, Dusthaven was split down its single dusty street, half the town whispering of shame, the other half whispering of honor, as though the square itself had been cut in two by the sight of one woman collapsing under lashes and 5 Comanche brothers kneeling at her side. Inside the livery loft, Nora lay on a bed of hay softened with quilts townsfolk had slipped in when no one was looking, her back raw and bandaged, each movement fire under her skin. The Comanche girl she had saved curled near her feet, refusing to sleep anywhere else, while the brothers kept quiet vigil in turns, their presence both shield and signal. Every knock on the stable door brought tension. Sometimes it was Clara from the bakery, bringing broth, sometimes a ranch boy carrying water, and sometimes only silence outside, the sound of boots shifting. Watchers debating if mercy was weakness. The mayor sat in his parlor fuming, red-faced under the lamplight, his pride bruised deeper than any lash. To lose control of a crowd, worse, to lose it to an orphan and 5 natives, was a humiliation he could not swallow. He called for men who owed him debts, promising coin and favors if they would speak loudly in the saloon, turning the story on its head. Nora had dishonored the town. Nora had made them look weak. Nora consorted with savages. The whispers spread like rot, and by nightfall some repeated them, eager to cling to the mayor's shadow rather than face the light of their own conscience. In the loft, Nora woke, gasping, sweat soaking her shift. Gabriel, the youngest, pressed a cloth to her brow, his voice calm as still water. "Pain makes lies sound louder," he told her softly. "But truth waits, steady like stone. Don't fear what they shout tonight." She tried to smile, but winced instead. "I wasn't brave," she whispered. "I just couldn't stand by." Elias, the eldest, who leaned against the post with his arms crossed, said in a voice low but unshakable, "That is the only kind of bravery there is." His words steadied her more than the poultice. Outside, laughter rose from the saloon, sharp and jeering, the words clear enough to carry, "Savage lover, blood traitor, orphan trash." Nora flinched, but the brothers did not move toward the sound. Instead, Raphael, the third, spread a blanket more firmly over her, saying, "Let them spend their breath. Tomorrow they will need it for truth." But the mayor's plan was not only words. At his table he drafted a petition. Writing in his heavy hand that Nora James endangered public order, that the Comanche brothers had trespassed into town with force, that law would collapse if honor were mistaken for justice. He sealed it with wax and pressed it into the hands of a rider, bound for the county judge. "We'll see how far their honor carries," he muttered. Back in the loft, Nora stirred again, and Thomas, the 4th brother, told her gently of how once, years ago, their sister had been accused unjustly, how they had sworn among themselves a vow that no child, no woman, would ever stand alone again if they had breath left. Nora listened, tears sliding silently into her hair, and though the night outside seethed with whispers and plotting, something firmer took root inside the livery, something stronger than law or fear. By dawn, the whole of Dusthaven seemed to breathe in 2 different directions, half the town moving with quiet steps toward the livery where Nora lay, the other half crossing the street to avoid it, as though mercy itself were a contagion. The bakery woman came again, this time with biscuits wrapped in cloth, whispering that she had heard men in the saloon planning to drive Nora out by sundown. A rancher's boy slipped in behind her, leaving a tin of milk without a word, before hurrying back to his father, who still cursed Nora's name. Outside, men loyal to the mayor gathered in knots, pretending at casual talk but carrying rifles across their shoulders in broad daylight. Inside the loft, Nora shifted restlessly, her back burning, the Comanche girl curled tightly against her side as though shielding her in return. Elias, the eldest brother, leaned on the window frame, scanning the street below with an expression carved from stone, while Mateo sharpened a knife with slow, steady strokes, though his eyes kept sliding toward Nora, as if to reassure himself she still breathed. Gabriel, the youngest, sat at her bedside, threading strips of rawhide together into a crude crown, his brow furrowed in thought. "This town wants to choose," Raphael said quietly, his voice carrying across the loft like the rustle of dry grass. "They will not stand in silence much longer. Either they join us, or they join him." Thomas, the 4th, spat into the dust, his voice rough. "And if they join him, they'll drive us out with blood." Nora stirred, opening her eyes enough to catch their words, and though her throat was raw, she whispered, "I don't want anyone hurt because of me." Gabriel looked at her, his gaze steady. "You bled for someone who was not you. That choice already changed this town. Now it must decide what kind of people it wants to be." The words lingered heavy in the rafters. By mid-morning, Clara Jenkins the baker stood outside, arguing with the mayor himself. "She saved a child, George," Clara snapped, her voice shaking but loud enough for neighbors to hear. "If you call that crime, you'd better arrest every mother in town." The mayor's face flushed crimson as he shouted back, "She shamed us before outsiders. She made a fool of Dusthaven." People paused at their chores to listen, some nodding with Clara, others muttering that George was right, that mercy would only weaken the town's law. In the loft above, Nora heard the voices carry and felt her heart seize with guilt. But Gabriel touched the crown of rawhide he had woven, placing it lightly in her palm. "Hold this," he said softly, "until you believe you deserve it." She looked down at the rough braid, tears blurring her sight, and for the first time since the lash had fallen, she let herself imagine a life not defined by pain, but by honor, freely given. By afternoon, the mayor had gathered his loyalists in the square, near 24 men with rifles and hard faces, their boots planted wide as if fear could be beaten back by stance alone. He stood at their front, puffed up like a rooster, voice carrying down Main Street. "This is the last day we let outsiders shame our law. That orphan is no savior. She is disorder, and those 5 Comanche only came to claim us weak. We'll drive them all out before sundown." His words rippled through the town, drawing wives and children to doorways, some nodding grimly, others paling with shame. In the livery loft, Elias watched from the window, his jaw set tight. "They'll come for us," he said flatly. Mateo's knife paused on the whetstone. Raphael's hand tightened on the beam. Nora stirred, hearing the crowd, her throat dry. "Let me go," she whispered, pushing against the quilt. "If I leave, maybe they'll stop." Gabriel pressed her back with a gentleness that brooked no refusal. "You gave your back for a child. We will give ours for you." Then a cry split the square, not from the mayor's men, but from the bakery door. Clara Jenkins had marched forward, flour still dusting her hands, dragging behind her the very Comanche girl who had been spared the lash. The child's small hand clutched Clara's apron, her eyes wide but determined. "You call this justice?" Clara shouted, her voice quivering with fury. "Then you call yourselves liars. That girl did nothing but live, and Nora James bled for her while you laughed." Murmurs rose. Some men shifted uneasily, rifles lowering a fraction. The mayor sneered. "You'd have us bow to a savage child?" Clara turned to the crowd, her hand trembling as she lifted the girl's wrist. "Bow to a child? No. Bow to decency. Bow to the truth you all saw with your own eyes." Then, in a moment no one expected, the girl herself pulled free and walked into the square, tiny and shaking but unflinching. She lifted the hem of Nora's torn apron Clara had brought with her, showing the bloodstains still stiff in the fabric. Gasps rippled. Women wept. Men swallowed hard. The image of that ragged cloth was louder than any speech. From the loft, Gabriel saw it and whispered, "Now they know." The brothers exchanged a glance, and in a single motion all 5 descended into the square, not with weapons but with open hands. They knelt together around the child, heads bowed, repeating in one voice, "No child alone." The words struck like a hammer against the mayor's bluster. Farmers lowered their hats. A blacksmith stepped forward and laid down his hammer at the child's feet. "She's right," he said. "Nora's the only one who showed us honor." The square cracked open, some still clinging to the mayor's shadow, but others stepping across to stand near Clara and the girl. The line between law and decency had been drawn in the dust, and the town could no longer look away. The square had barely settled into uneasy silence when the mayor stepped forward, his boots grinding over the dust as if to erase the trail Clara and the child had carved. His face was blotched red, eyes glittering with fury, and when he spoke, it was with the booming authority of a man who had ruled through fear too long to surrender it easily. "You think kneeling tricks and children's tears will hold this town together?" he thundered, sweeping his arm toward the 5 Comanche brothers still crouched around the girl. "They come here with no land, no law, and you cheer them while they shame you. You forget who feeds you, who lent you seed when your fields were dry, who kept your barns from the auction block. You cross me now, and I will see every debt collected, every crop seized, every roof torn down for timber. I will leave Dusthaven nothing but ashes and beggars if you turn against me." His words struck like a lash of their own, faces paling across the square as men and women remembered the ledgers signed in desperation, the coin they owed that bound them tighter than rope. Some lowered their eyes, the weight of his grip pulling them back into silence, fear curling around their spines like smoke. Nora, hearing from the loft where Gabriel had half carried her to the window, felt her chest ache worse than the lashes. She saw shoulders slump, hands drop, hope wither. The mayor smiled at that flicker of fear, feeding on it like kindling. "Do you want your children starving?" he pressed. "Do you want to see your farms stripped bare because you chose a bleeding orphan and 5 strangers over the man who built this town?" Murmurs rippled. Some turned away, unwilling to meet Clara's eyes, unwilling to meet the girl's. Gabriel glanced at Nora, her lips white with pain but her eyes steady. "This is how he wins," she rasped. "Not with guns, not with whips, with hunger." Elias stepped forward then, his voice low but carrying like thunder over the plains. "No man builds a town by chaining its children and bleeding its widows. If Dusthaven has survived, it is because its people worked, sweated, buried, and rose again. He only took." His words steadied some, but the mayor laughed, sharp as a knife. Bold words from a man whose kind raid cattle in the night. The insult was meant to split them further, to poison the fragile unity blooming in the square. Raphael, the 3rd brother, rose slowly, dust streaking his trousers, and spread his arms wide, showing his empty hands. "We carry no rifles. We came because she carried pain, not hers. If that is savagery, then perhaps savagery is the only honor left." The crowd stirred, shame prickling some, anger at the mayor stirring others. But the threat of debt, of barns seized, still clung heavy. Nora pressed her hand to the window frame, her body trembling, and called down with the last strength in her throat, her voice breaking but fierce enough to cut through. "He says he built you, but you built yourselves. He says he owns your bread, but bread baked by your own hands fed me when I had nothing. He cannot starve what you refuse to surrender." The words cracked something, small but real, a murmur swelling through the crowd as men and women looked at their own hands, at the earth beneath their boots, at the truth they had buried under fear. The mayor saw it, and his smile faltered, rage twisting his features as he spat. "You'll regret this. By sundown, Dusthaven will remember who owns it." He turned sharply, signaling to a pair of riders lurking at the edge of town, and the square felt the air shift, the threat of violence drawing close like storm clouds on the horizon. The mayor's signal had barely flicked before 2 riders spurred their horses forward, dust boiling up behind them as they circled the square like wolves around sheep, rifles slung low and eyes hard with the promise of violence. Townsfolk scattered from their path, skirts and hats snatched by the wind, while the mayor folded his arms smugly, certain fear would do what his words had not. "See," he crowed, his voice cutting through the commotion. "One shout from me and you scatter like hens. You dare defy the man who keeps the riders fed?" The horses clattered past the livery, rattling its doors. From the loft window, Nora pressed against the frame, her back aflame, her heart seizing as she saw mothers pull children from the street. Men who had moments ago stood tall, now ducking behind barrels, every face bowing to fear again. Elias motioned to his brothers, calm and steady. "Stay low," he murmured, though his eyes never left the riders. Mateo's knife gleamed at his belt. Raphael clenched his fists. Thomas flexed his shoulders. Gabriel glanced once at Nora before stepping into the open, his rawhide crown still dangling from his hand. Gasps rose as the youngest brother walked straight into the rider's path. "Fool!" one of the horsemen spat, yanking his rein so close the animal's breath steamed over Gabriel's face. "Move, or you'll be trampled." But Gabriel stood still, his voice level. "If you want them to kneel, you'll ride me down first." The words cracked over the square louder than a rifle. Elias and the other brothers joined him, forming a wall of flesh and will, unarmed but unflinching. The crowd held its breath as the riders reared their mounts, hooves striking sparks from the stones. At the loft window, Nora felt despair claw her chest, until the small Comanche girl, the one she had saved, slipped from Clara's grasp and ran straight into the square. She darted between the brothers, planting her thin body before Gabriel, her voice ringing high and sharp. "No child alone!" The vow leapt from her lips like fire, and in its echo a murmur spread, men whispering it to themselves, women clutching children and repeating it. Clara said it aloud, then the blacksmith, then 3 ranchers at once, until the whole square rolled with the words, a chant rising against the mayor's roar. "No child alone! No child alone!" The riders faltered, their mounts stamping uneasily at the sound. The brothers dropped to their knees as one, surrounding the girl, open palms raised, honoring her courage the same way they had honored Nora. The crowd gasped, the sight burning into their eyes, 5 warriors kneeling not in defeat, but in chosen humility, declaring before God and town alike that honor did not ride rifles, it knelt with the weak. The chant swelled, rattling the windows, drowning the mayor's fury. "No child alone!" Nora, trembling at the window, felt tears sting her lashes as she whispered it, too, her voice raw but alive. For the first time, the fear that had ruled Dusthaven wavered, cracked open by one small voice echoed by 100 more, and the riders, men paid in threats and coin, looked at each other and found no command in their reins. The chant still shook the air when the mayor shoved through the crowd, his face twisted with the fury of a man watching his grip slip grain by grain through clenched fists. "Enough," he bellowed, his voice cracking, but the words, "No child alone," rolled right over him like thunder across the plains. The riders pulled their horses back, uneasy, their eyes darting to the townsfolk who no longer cowered but shouted louder, fists pounding against wagon rails, women raising their children high as if to prove they had nothing left to fear. The mayor's jaw clenched. He needed a harder weapon than words. He thrust his hand into his coat and yanked out a folded ledger, the pages creased and heavy with ink. He held it high so the sun struck the wax seal, his voice dripping venom as he shouted, "You think honor feeds you? You think chance pay debts? Every name in this book owes me. Every one of you lives by my hand. Barns, cattle, seed, tools, it is all mine until your debts are cleared. And if you follow her, if you side with these savages, I will call them all due tonight. Every acre will be mine, every crib emptied, every roof torn down to repay what you owe." The chant faltered, voices thinning under the weight of old fear. Men looked at their boots, Women clutched shawls tighter. The ledger was more terrifying than rifles. In its ink lay the truth of how he'd bound the town for years, turning hunger into chains no knife could cut. He slammed it against his palm for emphasis, the sound sharp as the crack of the lash. "This is your law. She shamed you, they mocked you, and now you'll pay me every last grain or crawl on your bellies." Silence crept back like poison. The brothers stood unmoving, still kneeling around the girl, their eyes hard but calm. Gabriel glanced at Nora in the loft window. She was pale, trembling, but her lips moved in defiance, whispering the vow even as the crowd sagged. She knew his book well. Samuel, her late neighbor, had lost his farm to its ink, and her own meager wages had vanished into its pages. Clara Jenkins stepped forward again, voice breaking but clear. "And if every name is in there, George, then you've robbed us all. You've fattened yourself on our hunger." The mayor sneered, shoving the ledger toward her. "Robbed, or lent with your own mark signed, don't speak of robbery when your flour was bought with my coin." He turned back to the crowd, his grin widening as he saw doubt and fear coil tighter in their eyes. "You cannot fight the lash, and you cannot fight ink. You are mine, as surely as she was when she lay in the dust." At that, Nora's voice cracked the air, hoarse but fierce. "You own nothing but fear." She leaned hard against the frame, her wounds screaming, but her words carried. "This book is not law. It is a list of theft. If you bow to it, you bow forever. But if you burn it, he is nothing." The crowd gasped at the word burn. The mayor's smile faltered, clutching the ledger tighter, his knuckles white. The brothers rose slowly, Elias's voice rumbling like distant thunder. "Then let Dusthaven decide what it kneels to, ink or honor." The townsfolk shifted, torn between terror of hunger and the new fire that had begun to kindle in their hearts. The square trembled. The mayor clutched the ledger to his chest as though it were a holy relic, his breath heaving, eyes wild, the crowd sagging again under the weight of fear he had thrown like a net. Dusthaven teetered in silence, the chant smothered but not gone. The 5 Comanche brothers standing tall in a circle of dust, their vow still hanging in the air like smoke waiting for flame. Then the spark came. Not from Elias, nor Gabriel, nor Clara, but from a boy no older than 12, a skinny ranch hand whose father owed half his herd to the ledger. He stepped forward from the crowd, his bare feet leaving marks in the dust, and with a cry more animal than child, he leapt at the mayor, snatching the ledger with both hands. Gasps exploded. The mayor staggered, caught off guard by the boy's desperation. And in that heartbeat, the boy hurled the book into the dirt. Pages fanned open like wings. For a breath, the square stood still. Then the youngest brother, Gabriel, was moving, snatching a torch from a wagon rail, its flame still smoldering from the morning's branding fire. He dropped to his knees beside the scattered ledger, holding the torch above the ink. The mayor screamed, lunging forward, "No, that book is mine!" But Elias intercepted him, a wall of flesh and fury, shoving him back so hard he sprawled in the dust. The crowd gasped, eyes fixed on the torch. Gabriel looked up, sweat streaking his brow, voice steady, asking not the brothers but the people. "What do you kneel to, his debts or her sacrifice?" Clara's voice cut through, hoarse but loud. "Burn it!" A rancher's wife shouted the same, then another man. Then a chorus of voices building like storm wind. "Burn it! Burn it!" The chant rolled, replacing "No child alone" with a new fire. The mayor clawed at the dirt, scrambling to snatch the book, but Mateo and Raphael blocked him, their shoulders squared. Gabriel lowered the torch. Flames licked the pages, curling the inked names into ash. A collective cry tore from the crowd, half fear, half release, as if something invisible had snapped. The mayor's face drained of blood as smoke coiled upward, black against the noon sky, his power turning to dust before his eyes. He shrieked, "You fools! That ledger held your lives!" But the blacksmith's widow shouted back, her voice fierce, "No, it held your lies!" And the crowd roared agreement, the weight of years lifted in a single burning moment. Men who had hunched under debts stood taller. Women clutched their children with relief rather than dread. The boy who had first leapt at the mayor knelt beside Gabriel, staring at the burning book, and whispered, "No child alone." The words spread again, louder, carried by the fire itself, until the chant rose stronger than before, a vow reborn in flame. The mayor scrambled on hands and knees, but Elias planted a boot on his arm, pinning him, voice low and grim. "It's finished, George. Your law burns with your lies." The crowd surged closer, not with fear now, but with fury and hunger for justice, the air vibrating with a storm that no whip or coin could stop. Nora, watching from the loft, clutched the frame with bloodied fingers, tears streaking her face as she saw the fire climb and the town rise with it, her sacrifice no longer just hers, but a seed that had split the ground wide open. Smoke curled over the square, the ashes of the ledger carried on the wind like the end of an era, and for a heartbeat, Dusthaven breathed free, shoulders lifted, spines straightened, the chant of "No child alone" echoing louder than the crack of any whip. But freedom for some meant death for one, and the mayor, pinned under Elias's boot, felt his empire turning to smoke. Rage surged hotter than fear. With a guttural snarl he wrenched free, ripping a pistol from the inside of his coat. Gasps tore through the crowd as steel flashed in the sun. "You'll all crawl back," he roared, his face red with desperation. "You think ink and ash can feed you? You'll die on your knees and she'll die first." He aimed the pistol towards the loft, where Nora clung to the window, her face pale but her eyes steady, refusing to hide even as the barrel found her chest. The square froze, breath caught between beats. Clara screamed, mothers dragged children back, men froze in half steps. But before the mayor's finger could tighten, Gabriel lunged, his body cutting through dust like an arrow loosed. He slammed into the mayor, the shot bursting wild into the air, echoing against the hills. Horses reared, men shouted, chaos ripped through the square. The pistol skittered across the dirt, snatched by Mateo's quick hand, and in an instant the five brothers formed a wall around Nora's bloodied apron still hanging on Clara's arm. The mayor staggered to his knees, eyes rolling wild, spit flying as he screamed, "You'll regret this! I'll burn this town to the ground myself!" He fumbled for a knife strapped at his boot, but Elias caught his wrist, their struggle a brutal dance of strength and hate. The townsfolk, shaken but stirred by fire still licking the air, surged forward, not to flee, but to stand. The blacksmith's widow shoved past, grabbing a board from a wagon rail. A farmer swung his shovel. The ranch boy who had first leapt for the ledger lifted a stone. One by one, Dusthaven closed in, no longer spectators but a tide of hands and voices that refused to yield. Elias forced the knife to the ground, Thomas pinned the mayor's shoulders, Raphael bound his wrists with a strip torn from his own belt, Mateo planted the stolen pistol into the dirt, and Gabriel, chest heaving, lifted his voice not in fury but in steady command. "Enough! No more blood!" The crowd hushed, breath ragged, as he pulled the mayor to his feet and faced the people. "This man ruled you with fear," he said, his voice loud, steady, carrying across every trembling ear. "Today you chose something stronger." His words rippled, sinking into hearts long bent beneath debt and lash. The mayor struggled, spat, cursed, but no one moved to free him now. Instead, hats lowered, heads bowed, not to him but to Nora, who watched from the loft window, her body broken but her spirit blazing brighter than fire. She whispered to herself, her lips barely moving, "It's not fear that holds us. It's each other." And below, for the first time, the mayor stood not as master of Dusthaven, but as a man undone, surrounded by the very people he had owned, his last strike broken by unity he could never understand. The mayor writhed in Thomas's grip, red-faced and spitting curses, but the pistol lay useless in the dust, the ledger nothing but ash swirling over boots and hems, and for the first time in living memory, his threats hung limp in the air. Dusthaven stood silent, staring at the man who had held their stomachs, their land, their children hostage with ink and fear. Then Clara Jenkins stepped forward, flour still dusting her sleeves, her voice cutting like a plow through silence. "I owe this man nothing. Every coin I paid bought hunger, not bread." She turned to the crowd, lifting her chin. "And neither do you." For a breath, no one moved. Then the blacksmith's widow limped into the square, clutching her shawl close, voice shaking but fierce. "My Tom broke his back at Crane's forge. We fed his belly while mine went empty. Debt? Let him eat my grief." She spat in the dust, the crowd gasping at the boldness. A farmer added his voice, hoarse. "He took my cattle when the rains failed, called it repayment, called me lazy. That's not law, that's theft." And another. Then another. Voices breaking open until a river of testimony poured forth, each name in the ledger spoken not as burden, but as proof of theft. The mayor sagged under the weight of their words, his bluster sputtering, his curses thinning into whimpers. Elias shoved him forward, forcing him to his knees in the dirt where he had once paraded others. Gabriel looked to the people, his rawhide crown still braided in his palm. "You were owned by a book," he said evenly, his voice carrying. "But that book is gone. You are free if you claim it. The choice is yours." The crowd shifted, breaths thick. And then slowly, men and women began to kneel, not to the mayor, not to law, but in a circle around Nora, who leaned on the loft window, tears streaking her dust-stained face. They knelt for the orphan who had bled for a child that wasn't hers, who had chosen humanity when silence was safer. The Comanche brothers rose as one, lifting Nora's torn apron Clara had carried into the square. Elias held it high, still stiff with blood, then laid it across her shoulders with reverence, as though crowning her not with fabric but with truth itself. Gabriel stepped into the center, finally setting the braided crown upon her head, his words ringing steady. "She carried our pain. Now we carry her honor." The people murmured assent, some weeping, some holding their children close. A town unshackled not by law or coin, but by a shared vow that had risen from one act of sacrifice. The mayor sagged to the dust, bound and shaking, no voice left to wield. Dusthaven had chosen its verdict, and it was not written in his ink, but in the blood and courage of a woman they could no longer ignore. The night after the ledger turned to ash, Dusthaven did not sleep. Lamps burned in windows, voices carried low but steady. Neighbors who had once eyed each other with suspicion, now speaking of seed to share, fences to mend, bread to divide. In the loft above the livery, Nora lay swaddled in quilts stitched by hands that once ignored her, her back raw but tended with poultices, her fever cooled by the Comanche brothers who kept watch in shifts. The young native girl she had saved nestled at her side, fingers curled around Nora's bandaged hand, as if refusing to let her slip away. When dawn's first light cut across the plains, the brothers gathered with her, Gabriel kneeling to set the simple rawhide crown gently on her brow again, while Elias spoke in his deep rumble, "You bled for one who was not yours. Today you belong to all of us." She tried to protest, whispering hoarsely, "I'm no leader, no saint. I was just an orphan who couldn't stand still." But Raphael shook his head, laying a hand over hers. "That is why you belong. Only those who know hunger share bread freely." Below, the townsfolk had gathered in the square, not with jeers but with baskets, apples, loaves, bolts of cloth, jars of milk, each offering laid at the livery doors, small tokens of gratitude to a woman who had once been invisible to them. Clara Jenkins wiped her eyes, whispering, "No child alone?" And the words spread, whispered back, until it rose as softly as the morning wind, a vow remade in dozens of voices. The mayor sat bound in the jailhouse, powerless, his reign ended not by bullet, but by conscience. His threats echoed no further than the iron bars that caged him. By mid-morning, the brothers led Nora into the sunlight, slow and steady, the crowd parting without command. Mothers bowed their heads, children clutched their hands, men removed their hats. Gabriel carried the rawhide crown in both hands until he reached the center of the square. Then he placed it back on Nora's brow and stepped away. One by one, the brothers knelt, palms open, not as warriors demanding respect, but as men giving it. Then something no one expected happened. The crowd followed. Men dropped to knees, women bowed low, children mirrored them, not to worship, but to honor a vow made flesh. Nora, trembling under the weight of it, felt tears burn her eyes. She tried to speak, but her voice broke, and so she only whispered the words back to them. Her lips quivering, "No child alone." A hush settled, thick and alive. The youngest child in the crowd repeated it, then another, until it became a chorus, a prayer not tied to church or law, but to humanity itself. The brothers rose then, not with ceremony, but with the quiet dignity of men who had kept their vow. Elias clasped Nora's hand once, his eyes steady. "You are their keeper now," he said, and with that the five turned toward their horses, leaving the town to carry its own fire. As their silhouettes faded against the horizon, Nora stood crowned in rawhide, the Comanche child at her side, the townsfolk arrayed around her like a circle of guardians. The sun rose higher, spilling gold across roofs and faces, and Dusthaven, for the first time in years, looked less like a place of fear and more like a home. And in that light, where scars burned but did not break her, Nora finally understood. She had not been crowned with leather, but with the weight of honor itself, an honor built not on blood or tribe or law, but on the simple vow of humanity that would outlive them all. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had stood in Dusthaven that day, would you have knelt with the brothers too? Tell us in the comments.